Geographers, okay, we're back. Now talking about historical geology. So last time was physical geology. And once again, god dang it, we're geographers, right? That's what we're doing. Keep that in mind. Remember, automatic F if you write that anywhere. If you write the word geologist. So yeah, we're geographers, but we're going to be talking about geology because it's useful to understand how geology works when we're doing our geography stuff. All right, so today, historical geology. And more specifically, what this will be looking at is just geologic thought, like being logical about the earth. So, geology, like with the physical geology stuff, it can feel like, it's just memorizing what kind of rock is this or that or whatever. But actually, one thing that I have to give geologists credit for is just their problem solving, their critical thinking, a lot of just, brilliant concepts about how to deal with all of this information, or I should say, all of this data we have around us, right? And how we can turn that data into actual information. So some of this will be kind of more, feel more philosophical that I talk about right now. But then we'll also get into the mechanics of this stuff, like how we know the Earth is as ancient as it is. And this, as I've said, this is something I want you to commit to memory. How old is the Earth? Based on the latest scientific evidence? Right, perfect. I'm assuming you said 4.6 billion years old. That's what we are. And that'll be again, like I'll show today, why that is important. Not just that we know this number, but why knowing that the Earth is ancient is an important thing, right? That's the idea. And so we'll get into how we know that stuff. That's the plan for today. Now, historical geology is in contrast to the physical stuff. We're looking at what's a rock, what's a mineral, and all of that. Historical geology is where we're looking at the origins of and the evolution of the planet. Big picture stuff. And, you use a little physical geology to help make sense of this stuff. But we're looking at that big picture of, not only how old is the Earth, but what does it look like, right? How did it come to be? How has it changed over the years? And really what we're doing, because we cannot go back in time and witness any of this stuff, is we're looking at the rocks, this incredibly ancient stuff that we have around us. We're looking at that to get a sense of, what's the deal? What's happened here? What is this story of the Earth and how it's changed and all that? So that's what these folks are interested in. Now, to understand the Earth and all the stuff that historical geologists want to understand, we need to think about time, and think about time in a very different way from which we have thought about time up until now. All right, so in this class, I've discussed time and with a very human scale to it, right? Like when we're finding longitude. And we had solar noon, and then we check the time back in Greenwich, and we do our little, times 15 and all that stuff. We know exactly where we are, what our longitude is, right? But that's something easy, like we can work that out on a sheet of paper. We can get that, right? Weather is a short-term thing. It's something we can experience, right? Daily changes, which we're seeing that here in the Antelope Valley right now in April of 2020. It's cold and rainy, and it's hot, and then it's really cold and windy, and then it's hot again, and then it rains again, and all of that. But that's very short term. We can experience these daily changes here. But what we're getting into now are different conceptions of time, things that we haven't yet really covered. I did a little bit with climate and this kind of long-term, big concept of time, but we'll really dig into it right now. All right, so a lot of this, what we're dealing with here, it's the result of a different sense of time. It's a moment in time in terms of history, where we're looking at what happened with both the agricultural and the industrial revolutions in Britain. Okay? And it's the idea that with, yeah, I'm not even going to dwell on, I'm trying to think of the dates now. It might be technically in England. We're dealing with the agricultural revolution, but don't worry about that. It's not a history class. So we're not going to dwell on that. But the agricultural revolution was just learning how to make more food, right? How to get better at that stuff, and you have more food coming in. It's a healthier society in the sense that there's more food coming in, maybe not necessarily going to everybody equally, but still more food is being produced. And then we have Watts and his steam engine, and the industrial revolution, just being able to have all these machines that help people make stuff, and it just really gets the economy going. And again, it's a case of, it's great for the industrialists, the capitalists who, own the factories and the machines and all that. We've all, we've seen like Charles Dickens stuff, like whether it's A Christmas Carol or other stuff. You got a lot of poor people who are also suffering, a lot of these factory workers. But at the same time, we do start to see life getting a little more comfortable for people. And there's not really a middle class in that true sense of the word as we use it today. Class itself doesn't, quite exist in the same way as it does today, and will start to come after the industrial revolution. But still, we see people with a little more comfort in their lives, or leisure, right? Where you just have free time, which is something, I mean, for some of you, you might have nothing but leisure time, free time all around you. For others, like myself included, I've got little kids. I'm trying to teach, every subject in second grade as well as fifth grade and eighth grade, and oh, it's great. So yeah, people have time, leisure time, and what they do with it is they sit around and they think about stuff, reflect on things, question stuff. Are you doing that now? Those of you listening to this who have nothing but time, are you sitting around and pondering the meaning of life or how things work, or that kind of stuff? Of course not, right? Because we have phones, we have the internet, and stuff like that. And I'm just as guilty. Like, not that I have much free time, but I would really love to like use this time to write a book or do something like that. I've seen some funny videos online. Yeah, that's what we do. We kind of bombard ourselves with silliness online to pass the time, so we don't have to think. Right? We kind of help ourselves not think, so we can kind of relax in that way. But with these folks, pre-phones, pre-internet, pre-social media, whatever, a lot of individuals who just said, "Huh, I wonder why this is the way it is," right? Or that is the way it is, or whatever. And at the same time, too, with this new economy going through Britain, and eventually will go down to the rest of Europe, and eventually that'll come over to the US, and it'll go over to Japan. So we see it spreading around, but starting here, like in England, and the northern part of the country, we have, canals are being dug to be able to, waterways, so you can ship stuff on barges and stuff like that. So there, people are digging in to the ground. You also have, the need for iron ore as well as coal to be able to make stuff like steel that is helping to make more machines and so on. So it's not only are people more comfortable, they have more time, but there's also people are digging into the ground and finding stuff, or traveling over longer distances and comparing two different places. And so that's leading to questions. Another key thing, too, is that society is becoming more and more connected. So we have a postal system in England, right, with the idea that you can finally, consistently send letters, and you don't have to rely on like, hey, can you take this letter to somebody for me? Like, there's an actual system in place, something we take for granted today. But that was a massive change for society in England, and that would be brought over here to the United States as well. And one thing this allows people to do is to send off for information, and people can learn from afar. They might not get an actual college degree out of it, But you can start to gather information, which is a huge thing. College traditionally, the way we think of it today is like anybody can go to college and hurrah, but really, college, university, the better way to describe it, was set up for, the wealthy sons of, already wealthy people, either, nobility or industrialists here or whatever, who, could be at Oxford or Cambridge, and, be full time students. And it was just a way to get kind of well educated about how the world works. And then you'd come back and you'd, take over for dad. That's what it was. But now you can have people who weren't wealthy. Normal folks could technically get the latest in scientific research, new information, literature, like whatever it might be. You could send off for it, have, buy stuff, have it shipped to you. So a lot of people now are getting more access to information. People who wouldn't normally have that. They're starting to travel further. They're starting to explore a little more. And these people are starting to question everything, especially the origins of stuff. And it's really key with this to stress that the people who are asking these questions, like the first geologists, were starting to arise at this time, as well as, the term naturalist kind of covers what geographers do today, where it's kind of a blend of stuff, of, biology and geology and that stuff. But the first geologists, geographers, biologists, all these different scientists who are starting to do research and question things, they're not anti God, which quite often people accuse, Darwin especially, of being just anti God because he's, going against the Bible and all this stuff. And that's not the case at all. A guy like Darwin was actually a devout Christian. He was kind of tormented by what he was finding, as well as what it was, what it meant for the official church message. And that's the key thing, is that the people who are doing this questioning, they're not questioning the existence of God, in the case of the folks in England questioning a Christian God, but instead they're saying, like, what the church, the men who are running this church are telling me doesn't quite make sense. Maybe we need to step back and rethink how the natural world works. And again, it doesn't mean that there's no God, God is dead, any of this stuff that we always hear and associate with science and all this stuff. But it was simply saying these men, they don't have all the answers. We're gonna work toward that. Okay, and that's the key thing, is that the church was the source of information, right? Because that's like, where else are you going to get information up until this point in time? And here's a great example. Bishop James Ussher he did what we could arguably say was a very scientific work. If you think back to my definition of science I presented to you guys at the very beginning of school, which feels like a million years ago now in light of all of this stuff. But the whole idea with science was, it's systematic, it's verifiable, it's repeatable. What Ussher did fit the criteria. And in fact, what he did was he just worked through history, right? So starting from today, or his, today, back in, 1650, he worked backwards to the Bible itself and the events of the Bible and the people in the Bible and all that, and just kept working back, right? So, so-and-so was the son of so-and-so, and would just kind of figure out what year it would have been when this person, died, and then when this person was born, therefore, and kept going back. And he was able to, using the Bible, systematically, verifiably, repeatably, all that stuff, he figured out that the earth began on Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC. All right, roughly 6,000 years ago, right, for us. Okay, and so he comes up with this, and it's solid. I mean, nobody can poke holes in it if you're assuming that the Bible itself is the literal word of God. If all of that stuff is in there is true, then that makes perfect sense. And so nobody argued with this. This was just accepted as, yes, this is how old the earth is. And while 6,000 years might sound pretty old, we call this the young earth model. Because honestly, compared to 4.6 billion years, 6,000 is nothing, right? That is a very young planet if that's what we're going with. So that's the idea for most people before, the all this industrial revolution stuff and the beginnings of geology and all that. It's just accepted that the Earth is, again, roughly 6,000 years old. Okay? Now, for this to work, though, you gotta have a certain belief here in what we call catastrophism, where it's saying that the way the Earth formed initially, it was very different, in terms of the laws of physics, nature, that kind of stuff, than it is today. Okay, where we have these incredibly dramatic, catastrophic events, floods and things, like the Great Flood, the Noah's Ark flood, is held up as something that we've never seen today, like in historical records and all of that. We don't see records of a global flood. We can have massive floods, but nothing has covered the entire planet, right? So we haven't seen that happen today. Therefore, just the way that rain worked and flooding works and all that kind of stuff back in the early days of the Bible, the early days of the planet, in the days of Noah, all this Old Testament stuff, uh, stuff worked differently, right? You could have a global flood then. We don't see it today. And it's also the case that with this global flood, not only did it wipe out the bad animals and all the stuff that's said in the Bible, it's also sculpting the planet, right? It's carving out big canyons and building up mountains and stuff like that. Okay, so it's the idea that all these incredibly dramatic landforms that we see, and even where the oceans are and aren't, and where land masses are and all that stuff, it's shaped in this way that we can't even comprehend because just nature worked differently, right? And so it's a case of, effectively, you would argue that God changed physics, right? Changed the laws of nature. And if you believe in an all powerful God, an all powerful creator, like if he creates physics in the first place, like why couldn't he change them, right? So, like, logically speaking, that's not, incorrect or a fallacy or whatever if you're going off of these assumptions, right? And that's just what everybody did if they even tried to think scientifically about what was going on in nature. Okay, now with some of these early geologists, whether people named, like I'll show in a bit, or just people kind of generally speculating about stuff, we start to see, like I said, a lot of questioning of official church answers. Okay, specifically like stuff like how old the Earth is, as well as just other kind of more basic stuff, like this image here on the screen. What is that? Anybody know? Yeah, that's what's what we call a poundstone. Okay, and so this poundstone was found all over parts of England, in the interior kind of rural areas. People would, dig into the hillsides and find these poundstones, and they were called poundstones because they all weighed roughly a pound. They're all roughly the same size, and so they were quite useful in like a marketplace. If you need to buy 5 pounds of something, you put, on that balance, you'll put 5 poundstones on one side, and you'll fill it up with, grain, flour, whatever on the other side until it balances out. Right? So they're quite useful for just an everyday commerce kind of way of doing things. All right? So poundstones, piece of cake. Except, wait a second. What does that look like? Anybody shout sand dollar? Yeah? Let's just, hopefully, yeah. Usually when I ask students, I realize so few of you have ever gone out of the desert and like seen the Pacific Ocean, which is not too far away. My God, people. Well, don't go now. Hold off because you're going to get arrested if you try to go into the water. But still, check out the ocean. It's worth a journey at some point. But yeah, it's a sand dollar. If we look at it, you see that little pattern there. And I don't know if you've ever found a sand dollar. I think as a kid, that was always my prize. Like I wanted so bad. Whenever my family would go to some coastal location, I really wanted a sand dollar. And every now and then I would get close, like looking on the beach, and I'd see one and off in the corner, and I go to pick it up, and it's broken. Which is garbage. It was never that complete one. And I wasn't going to spend like the $2 in the gift shop to go buy it or whatever. That's nonsense. But I could never get a complete one because they're garbage, because they're brittle and they break easily. And when you think about it, that sand, you ever held a sand dollar? That doesn't weigh a pound. It's lightweight, right? It's this tiny little brittle thing. So what is it? How does this sand dollar weigh a pound? You thinking what I'm thinking? It's fossils, right? It's a fossilized sand dollar, right? So again, going back to the physical geology stuff, it's not the sand dollar itself anymore. It's a rock that looks just like a sand dollar, right? That's the concept there. So it's a lot heavier because it's made up of minerals as opposed to, the calcium, whatever the brittle sand dollar stuff is, right? So that's why it's heavier. And somebody figures this out, right? Where we have, people are traveling more. Someone finally leaves his hometown, goes out to the coastline and says, "Oh, look, it's a poundstone." But wait a second, it's brittle, and puts two and two together, sees that it's it's a fossil, and fossils are starting to become quite popular. They're a hip thing to study. People are realizing what they are. We're discovering more of these as people are churning up the earth to find precious mineral and rock resources, or to build these canals or whatever. So people are into fossils, and so folks realize that, okay, it's a fossilized sand dollar, but what is it doing here, miles away from the ocean? Like, shouldn't we find these things over on the coastline where these sand dollars exist? And so this is a question that is brought to the church. Why are we seeing fossilized sand dollars miles away from the ocean? That's crazy. And the church's official response is, it's proof of God's awesome power. Right? It's the idea that the Almighty took these sand dollars, fossilized them, and sprinkled them out here in the countryside to remind us of how powerful He is. And the non-church people, the folks who have this question to start with, say, no, this doesn't make sense at all. And the reason why, and it's not, again, they're not saying that there is no God or anything like that. They're simply saying that's a stupid argument. That is a stupid idea. Yeah, God's responsible for this stuff, but he didn't just put these things here to show off or whatever. And if you think about it logically, like if you want to show off your awesome power, you do something once, right? In a crazy way. You don't put thousands of these things around the countryside. You put one in one place. It was like check this out. That'll mess with you. A good example, like around the Antelope Valley. Are you guys ever amazed when you just see garbage lying around the side of the road or whatever? Does that blow you away? Would you believe it if I said that pile of tires and mattresses and just filth? That's God. That's God showing His awesome power, right? No, nobody's gonna go like, "Oh, it's a miracle." Not at all, right? We look at the piles of trash and we think, "Oh, disgusting people," right? We assume it's people who did it, and it's because it's everywhere. It's kind of this commonplace thing, right? That makes sense. But one day, years ago now, I was out hiking around, just out in the desert, just exploring. I don't even know where I was exactly, but just kind of hiking around, exploring, having a great time. And as I'm cruising along, miles away from civilization, from the road even, or whatever, I come across on the ground right in front of me a single physics textbook, like an intro to physics, physics 101 kind of textbook, just right there on the ground in the middle of this trail right before me. And it freaked me out, right? Because why? There was no logical explanation. Like, it's not like somebody was saying, like, I really got to get some studying done. What am I going to do? I know I'm going to hike, 3 miles out this way to where it's quiet, to where I can really focus. And I'm going to lug this 10-pound textbook out here. No, that doesn't make sense. Or somebody was, like I don't know, I'm going to fly in my open biplane, and I'm going to read my physics textbook, and whoops, it falls out and it lands right. That doesn't make sense, right? I mean, that's a case where we could say it's God showing you that He controls the laws of physics. That I would buy, right? And that's not where I immediately went. I actually thought that it was a sniper. I just assumed that as I'm looking, like, what's this? Like somebody's up on the hill ready to pick me off. So I do like a dive and a roll, and I get the hell out of there. I think I might have taken a picture before I did that, but still, that's where my mind went. Right? That was incredible. It wasn't that I found trash in the desert. It was that it was so weird. Right? So if God wanted to use these Poundstones to show off, he'd take one weird aquatic fossil, put it in the middle of a mountain far away from the coastline, and we would all go, that's amazing. Right? But no, there were thousands of these things all over the place. I mean, people used them constantly for, like I said, daily commerce. So instead of, speculating that it's God working magic, we map them, right? So we start to map out where these things are found. And sure enough, once you map this and compare it to the current coastline, you can see that this was most likely just where the coastline was, however many, hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, whenever it was. And people here are still accepting of the idea that the Earth is 6,000 years old or whatever, but still, they don't have a means of testing to see exactly how old stuff is. But still, it's a case of like, look, it makes way more sense that the ocean has just changed levels over some period of time, right? It's not necessarily that God is just pulling levers all the time and doing magic tricks here and there. These folks all thought that he was the one who created the stuff, started it off in the first place. But still, there were these things that were happening that seemed to be, they just made sense, right? Kind of like winding the clock and letting it go and do its stuff. That was the attitude, right? And so that's what people start to question and discover and realize. And we start to get some really impressive thoughts going on after this. And one of the first key people to really advance geologic thought was James Hutton, who like his big argument is that the Earth is not 6,000 years old. It's older. And he couldn't say exactly how old it is. That 4.6 billion year number, we'll get to that in a little bit. But he's saying, look, it ain't 6,000 years old. Okay? He's, instead saying that it's this ancient thing. And his quote, his, kind of famous thing is that it's this thing, a continuous cycle with, to quote Hutton, no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end. Meaning that there's no clue, like we'll never be able to say, like Usher did, that the Earth began on October 23rd, whatever it was, at a specific time. We'll never find that exact moment, that day one of the planet. There are no clues because it is just so ancient. And also there's no prospect of an end, meaning that like long after, we all die, the Earth will just keep churning along. Like it's not going to disappear anytime soon in this whole end of days scenario and all that. No. It is this thing that clearly, if you look at the rocks, you can see this has been around for a very long time and will continue to be around for a very long time. And we need to start thinking about the fact that the Earth is ancient and try to make sense of that, right? And his real key idea here, not just that it's, the Earth is old, but he advances this concept of uniformitarianism, which is a terrible word. It's clunky and all that, but it's an incredibly important concept, and it's also pretty simple. Okay, it's it's as complex as the name is. It's a really simple idea, and it's the idea that all of the laws of nature, all of the physical laws, all of the ways in which geology specifically works today, that stuff has been happening since the beginning of the Earth. Okay, so it's against catastrophism, which is saying that the laws of physics have changed, everything has changed. We don't have great floods anymore, stuff like that. because God decided to change nature. What Hutton is saying is no. Right? And again, I'm not an expert on Hutton, but as far as I know, he wasn't some atheist or whatever. And I bring this stuff up. I keep going back to the idea of religion because I know from experience that so many of AVC students are deeply religious, primarily Christian, which is why I focus on that. But I've had Muslim students as well who are coming from kind of the same idea. Jewish students where it's the idea that evolution and science and the ancient Earth and all that, like it's going against their religious upbringing. And my point here is that it doesn't have to be that way. Right? That all of these people who I'm gonna cover here and talk about later, especially when I get to Darwin, they weren't attacking God. No, again, they were attacking these individual men who were interpreting religion, Christianity specifically, and quite often doing it for their own gain and to kind of hold on to power and stuff like that. So it's just a way of letting you guys know you don't have to pick a side. Right? You don't have to be team Jesus or team science or however you want to say it up. That's absurd. And you can also be there. Plenty of atheist scientists, but there are also plenty of Christian, Catholic, religious scientists that exist. We'll talk about this more when we get to evolution, but that's why I keep going back to it. It's to let you guys know that you don't have to pick a team, right? But anyway, so it's the idea that uniformitarianism. It's not saying there's no God or whatever. It's saying that hey, what's going on the earth today? It's the same thing that's been going on since the earth started, right? Since it first showed up. And the tricky thing here is that when you look at these different processes, well, you can't really even see them. They're pretty much invisible. Like, what's this picture of? You guys, do you know? Is this Schmanian? Right, it's the Grand Canyon. Anybody been there? I'm assuming like 2 or 3 hands pop up because that's usually 2 or 3 hands pop up. First off, if you haven't been there, you gotta go. It's a fascinating. It's just amazing to it's grand. Some might say to see it. Like it was a case when I first looked at it. I knew it was going to be big, and you can see pictures like this, but just to be there, I've never seen a picture do it justice to just how massive this big hole in the earth is. It's quite remarkable, all right? But with that, if you've been there or if you go there, try to see if you can see the erosion taking place, because the Grand Canyon is still getting deeper. It's still being carved out by the Colorado River, the water running through there, but you can't look in there and see it. It's been going on for millions of years, where the water is slowly moving through, picking up little bits of weathered rock, picking up sand and silt and stuff like that, and carrying it away. And this gets into geomorphology that I'll talk about in like a couple of lectures. We'll cover some of this stuff, but it's the idea that we can't really witness it. It's invisible to us to see this little tiny grain of sand get picked up and move someplace else. That is a slow process. But with that, given enough time, we can get the Grand Canyon, right? If we go back 5 million years ago, roughly, the Colorado River didn't do this. The Colorado Plateau didn't look like this. But that's when this massive erosion started taking place. So given 5 million years, we can see major differences. But even in our lifetimes, let's say you go as a kid, you're like 10 years old and you go to the Grand Canyon, you look down in there and you could even take a picture from a specific spot, and then you could come back in your 90s. Same spot, take another picture. You're not going to see any differences at all, right? Invisible to us, but over time, incredibly powerful, right? And so based on this, we can also work our way back and we can get to some of the ways in which this stuff came to be, right? Just looking at the evidence that's there today, if we work from this concept of uniformitarianism, we can take all the evidence we see today, work backwards, and actually paint a scientific picture of how this thing came to be, right? Rather than saying, yeah, I don't know, at some point there's a big flood and like in a day or two it all just kind of, got carved out, right? There's no evidence for that, specifically taking place here. Right? So uniformitarianism is a way to deal with the evidence we have and work backwards and make sense of what's going on. Okay, that's the idea. And this also becomes incredibly important because Hutton, he presents this really credible evidence that the Earth is ancient. Nobody knows the exact number at this point, but we know it's got to be old, just based on. And Hutton gets. I'm not doing it justice because I'm trying to get through all this stuff, but he presents a really good picture of what's happening, and how he knows this and how uniformitarianism works and all of that. So it's accepted today. It's this, prevailing notion. It's what we all work off of if we're dealing with, working with problems from the scientific standpoint. But Hutton doing that really opens up possibilities. And Hutton's ideas themselves, they're not really even that mainstream. It would be Charles Lyell, who years later, takes up a lot of Hutton's ideas as well as his own, and he produces this Principles of Geology, which is going to advance just the concept of geology quite a bit. And then, of course, that book, and Lyell was something of a mentor to Darwin. Darwin has a copy of Principles of Geology on the Beagle as he's sailing around the world and piecing together natural selection. And as we'll see with evolution and natural selection and all the stuff that Darwin stated, that only works with the idea of an ancient Earth, right? To have enough time. Evolution's the exact same idea where it's invisible to us. We don't see it happening in our human lifetimes or before our very eyes, but given enough time, given millions of years, you can have massive results, right? Massive changes, incredible species diversity, and all of that. So Hutton's work was really fundamental in just allowing a lot of these natural and earth sciences to grow, right? To accept the idea that, oh, okay, yeah, if the earth has been around this long, the other stuff is slow, but hey, if it's got millions of years to operate, then yeah, this is how things could come to be, right? So uniformitarianism is an incredibly important concept that we still use today. And now that's not to say that stuff doesn't change, right? We'll see an example of that when we get into plate tectonics. I think next time we'll see that the Earth's magnetic field has changed, the geomagnetic field, which makes me laugh because I have you guys. It's on Netflix now. The Core movie from I don't know early 2000s, whenever that came out. It's oh, I'd never seen it, and I still haven't seen all of it because I had to stop. It's painful, but that's getting into the Earth's magnetic field and showing that it's dynamic. I don't think it's gonna stop anytime soon, like the movie. Just sad. The movie's really bad, but which means definitely watch it and giggle after you've read about the stuff. After maybe the plate tectonics lecture, really watching that. But it's the idea. Look, I'm digressing. It's the idea that the Earth's magnetic field has reversed, and it's weakened as well, but it's also reversed a handful of times in Earth's history. That's an example where the way something is going on today has been different in the past. But the difference here between just like catastrophism and what we're talking about now with the magnetic field is that we have evidence for it, that we see evidence. In this case, in the rocks. We'll get into exactly how we know some of this stuff. Next time, again, we'll get into plate tectonics when it's really important. But it's the idea that as we, are looking at stuff, we're finding evidence of, oh, okay, this way that nature works today has been different in the past. But we know, we take that into account, and that helps us, figure it out, tell our story of how this came to be, right? So that's another key thing with uniformitarianism. Yeah, nature can change, but we're looking for the evidence of that, and nature does leave evidence of that, and we're very good at detecting that stuff. Now, if we're dealing with this idea of the Earth being incredibly ancient, of it being 4.6 billion years old, well, we got to work to really think about what that means, right? To be able to comprehend it. Like, it's one thing for me to say, The Earth is 4.6 billion years old. It's another thing for me to actually understand what that means, right? Or for you to be able to understand what that means. And so, geologists and other scientists, people who study this stuff, have worked with this concept. We've tried to make it accessible for just anybody, for humans, because we're just not good at it. Now, this is a classic image that I've always liked, just in part because it looks like something from the 1960s. But it's showing, it goes back to 4.5 billion. If you can see that down here, we're saying 4.6. Don't worry about that 0.1. But it's to be able to put all of Earth's history on, say, a sheet of paper, on the screen, on a poster, whatever. It requires this spiral, right? Because just to do it simply in this linear fashion, it's crazy. It's way too long. It's a massive thing. And you can see this at, I think Griffith Observatory has something like this there. Museums will have this up where you'll be walking along, and they'll have on the wall or on the ceiling even, they'll show moments in time in the Earth's history. And the point is you have to walk quite a bit to cover everything, right? Because it's this massive amount of time. This here, what it shows, what's useful, I think, is to show how, from the standpoint of life on this planet, we can see how relatively new it is. Or if not just, life in general, at least the concept of complex, intelligent life. The things that we think of as being impressive examples of life, of organisms on this planet, right? Because we can go back to like 3 billion years ago, we're starting to see organic structures, or where we can technically say there are living things showing up. It's 2 billion years ago. We have this thing, whatever this thing is. I don't know. I'm not a paleontologist or biologist, so I don't know, some kind of amoeba-looking thing here, and we spiral around 1 billion years ago. We have this thing that looks like I don't know, a Twizzler or whatever. We keep moving around. We get, a jellyfish, right? And these little pond water looking things right here. Roughly 540 million years ago, we start to see, like water cockroaches, that kind of stuff. And so, right there, right, these things are not that complex or advanced or even adorable or anything like that, like we would think of. That's 540 million years ago, right? Meaning that the Earth had plenty of its existence where we didn't have anything quite like this. And as we continue we move around here, and we start to see dinosaurs, and then mammals start to show up, and we humans, we show up around here, right? Technically, if we're talking about Homo sapiens, right? Not hominids or whatever. But even if we go back to very kind of human-like ape creature things, that's what a hominid is. We'll talk about this stuff when we get into evolution. Even a lot of that's only showing up around here, right? A few million years ago, at best, is when we start to really see things that we could even begin to think of as being almost human. So that right there goes to show how our own experience as humans is very, very tiny compared to everything else that's gone on, right? And think about it too. I mean, it's so hard for us to think about time in this massive geologic sense, right? I don't even remember when I last saw you guys. I think it was mid-March. Right, I'm recording this like mid-April. I had to check it's mid-April. A little after mid-April. I don't remember exactly. It feels like it's been forever since I've seen any of you. I don't even know who you people are, right? Strangers to me. You probably feel the same way. It's crazy. It's been a month, maybe a month and a half. I don't fully have all the numbers yet. I haven't been clocking it, but you get the sense, right? for this month of being stuck inside, of not going anywhere. It's maddening, but that's just a month. It hasn't even been a year, nor multiple years, right? But it's how my brain as a human works, probably how yours works as well. So if we then start to even try to comprehend things that happen, not even like 1,000 years ago, that's mind blowing to think about how much time has actually passed, right? Let alone a million years or a billion years or whatever. And so that's a key thing if you want to study this stuff or even begin to, understand it, to make sense of it. So you really have to work and try to think about this new conception of time, right? We're not looking at this stuff from that human standpoint. We're looking at it from the Earth's standpoint. We're looking at a massive amount of time. Now, this is a way. I stole this from another guy, but I like it. Updated it a little bit, but it's the idea that if we're dealing with, in this case, it's 15 billion years. We're talking about the Big Bang. Okay, so the idea that we're working back to the not just the Earth itself, but the universe, right? The beginning of everything. That's roughly 15 billion years ago. 15 billion years. It almost doesn't matter what the number is because it's so meaningless, again, to humans like myself who are struggling to figure out, like, if it's been a month since I've last seen other humans outside of my family, any of that stuff, right? So if we put in here this 15 and a bunch of zeros after it, it gets really fuzzy really quick, right? But what this guy did was he compressed it. So instead of, years, he compressed it down to seconds, right? So each year is turned into 1 second, meaning if we, do the math here, to go back 15 billion seconds, that's 475 years. And that's something starts to make a little more sense to us, right? So based on that, going off of today, this current moment, we can start to get a sense of when stuff is showing up, how long things have existed, things along those lines. The Big Bang, in this case, would have happened in the year 1545. Okay? That's the beginning of everything. The Earth doesn't show up until 1874. So that's pretty incredible right there, to think about this gap, this massive gap in between the creation of the universe and then when the Earth itself actually shows up. But then, to make it even crazier, dinosaurs, which seems like they'd been around for a long, long, long time, just, millions of years ago, and all these big numbers, they're around from 2013 to 2018. That's not that long ago, right? If we think of it, like I can remember 2018. 2013 gets a little fuzzier, but still, that doesn't seem like that long ago, right? But that's when the dinosaurs exist. Humans, we show up about 2.5 minutes ago, right? We are new. We are babies here. The U.S. shows up. That's screwed up. Damn it. Oh, this is supposed to be weeks. That's what it is. Humans show up 2.5 weeks ago. I'm much too tired. It's too much work to get this stuff re-recorded or whatever. I'm leaving it in. My damn it and everything. So humans show up 2.5 weeks ago, which makes a lot more sense, and therefore the U.S. shows up 4 minutes ago. World War II ends 75 seconds ago. Fantastic, right? I mean, look at that. This is goes to show how this stuff, like human lifetimes, are such quick things in the grand scheme of stuff, right? If we go back to the creation of the universe, to the beginnings of the earth, all of these different things that we've been talking about, you can start to kind of get a sense of how things are relative to other things. When life shows up versus how the earth is, or when humans show up compared to other life on the planet, or whatever. So I think this is useful. If it is, great. If not, sorry for wasting your time. Now, one thing that's worth mentioning before we continue and going to move away from just this concept of deep time or geologic time is that what geologists often do, and I think it really just comes from the fact that a lot of these numbers are very difficult to use, that is instead of saying something happened so many millions of years ago or billions of years ago or whatever, they've divided up time into these different periods or eras or epochs or whatever, these different divisions of time. So geologists, quite often, they'll speak of stuff as happening in the Triassic or the Jurassic period. Um, more recent stuff, I'm sure I've already discussed the Holocene, the Pleistocene, as well as the Anthropocene, which is that kind of proposed new epic, arguing that we humans have really changed life on this planet, starting with the Industrial Revolution. So we should end the Holocene there and start the Anthropocene, which takes into account climate change. And that's the whole idea with these things. When we have a new eon or era or period or epoch, it's the result of something significant changing on the planet. And for a lot of this stuff that happened millions of years ago, it's the result of finding fossils or some kind of other evidence that suggests, oh, okay, we had this totally different type of life on the planet, or the atmosphere was doing something totally different, or whatever it might be. Once we see these big changes, geologists go in and they'll argue for, it's a very slow process, but they'll argue for, okay, this justifies a new period or a new epoch or whatever it might be. And I just bring this up so that as you are studying, if you're looking at stuff online, if you're reading through stuff, whatever it might be, like I don't use this that much because I'm not a geologist, but that's what these things mean. So if you see something like the Mesozoic is mentioned, it's just referring to this specific era in geologic history. So when we're dealing with dinosaurs, quite often we're referring to the Mesozoic, if not the specific Triassic or Jurassic or Cretaceous periods. Right? That's all these things mean. I'm not going to test you on them. If this were a geology class, I'm sure you would get tested heavily on this stuff. We're not going to worry about it, but at least you know what it means. Okay, now what we're going to get into is cover this idea of, all right, well, how do we actually know how old stuff is? Because with this, like if we go back to this time scale right here, a very logical question is, how do we know that this happened at this moment in time, right? How can we say that it happened either, during the Jurassic or during the Triassic, or we say something like, 220 million years ago or something along those lines? How can we actually say that with any confidence? And what geologists do is they need to be able to date whatever it is, the rock, the fossil, whatever it might be that we're looking at, right? To figure out exactly when did this rock form, or when did this fossil form, or whatever it is we're dealing with. And we have two ways in which we can do this. There's relative dating and then absolute dating. And I'm going to go through both of these and get into different ways in which they work. And by the end of this, hopefully, it'll all make sense for you. So, and here's an example. Relative dating, we can just say, so-and-so has a younger sister, right? And what that tells us is that you've got the first person, and then she has a younger sister, meaning first person is born, and then after that person is born, the sister is born, right? So we have an order, but I don't actually know how much younger this sister is than the original girl, right? That's the idea. That's what relative dating is. It's the idea that we have an order of events. First this happens, then that happens. But we don't know exactly what the time frame is necessarily between those two things, right? Because you could be born, and then 15 years go by and you have a younger sister born, or you could be born and then a year goes by and you have a younger sister that's born, right? So we know the order in which kids in this family were born, but we don't know absolutely when these things happen. The absolute dating example is that she was born 20 years ago and her sister was born 16 years ago. Right? So now, not only do we understand the order, but we can say, okay, first, this sister is born 20 years ago, and then 4 years pass, and then her younger sister is born. Right? And when we're dealing with humans, it's also easy. We can get the actual birth dates. We can know exactly what day, even what time one is born and the other is born. When we're dealing with geologic stuff, when we're dealing with stuff that took place millions of years ago, we never have the luxury of saying, okay, this happened on September 15th, 6 million BC, or something along those lines. What we typically are saying with our absolute dating is that this took place 6 million years ago, or sometimes we'll say 6 to 10 million years ago. Right? That's still an absolute date. We might have some questions here because of different complexities, whether we're looking for more evidence or you have a bunch of different evidence and it's giving you this time range. And we might get into that when I talk about Pangea later on, exactly how some of that works. But as long as I'm giving a number, we're talking about absolute dating. And if I'm giving an order, this happened before that, or that happened after this, that's relative dating. Right? That's the difference here. All right, now, relative dating is the first one I'm going to get into. And this is the easiest in the sense that really what we need to do is simply use logic and these rules or principles that I'm going to show you guys, talk about, that'll help you make sense of how geologists do this, how we get an order of events. Now, good news, because of everything, because of we're doing tests online on Canvas and the internet, well, everybody's impressed that the internet hasn't just collapsed. It's not great. Canvas isn't great right now. Some of you guys have experienced this. Some of you have talked to me about it as you're taking the test. That last test that we had, you're taking it, I have those images of the hydrological cycle up there, but they don't show up for you because, frankly, it seems that Canvas is getting bombarded with just pretty much every school in California uses Canvas. I don't know about the other states, but there's a lot of use of Canvas. So putting up images on a test, it's not going to work. All right, so normally I'll have some kind of diagram or map or something like that. Not going to be on your third exam. So I would have you become masters of relative dating. I ain't going to do that now because it just doesn't work out, right? So I'll have some questions on some of these principles, so know what they are. But the good news is you don't have to apply them, right? Because it's not worth it. But I'm still going to go through and explain how this works. So our first rule is the principle of original horizontality. Now this is simply stating that when we're dealing with sedimentary rocks or lava flows, we're not dealing with metamorphic rocks, so these things aren't universal for any kind of rock, but these specific ones, we're dealing with sandstone or basalt or whatever it might be, these things get deposited horizontally. All right, when they initially, it's all original horizontality, when they initially form or lithify, they're going to be nice and flat. Now, hopefully, if you're looking at this image here, it should be clear. We have three real layers, rock layers or units or strata. I think I introduced that word last time. It's a blur. Can't remember last month. But strata simply refers to layers in the rock. Okay, so each one of these different colored layers is a distinct stratum or rock layer. So we have this one on the bottom. In fact, let me make this look official. Oh, hold on. What the hell? Okay, maybe this. Oh, laser pointer. Yeah, like grandpa working on the computer. Okay, so there we go. There's my laser. So we have this one on the bottom. Down here, this darker color right here. That's one stratum. And we've got this guy in the middle. So there's number 2. And then this right here is our third one. Okay, so 3 distinct layers. And what we're saying here with this principle of original horizontality is that as these, let's just say it's sandstone, just to keep it simple, as these layers of sandstone form, remember that's just sand, getting eroded, carried away, piling up, we have the squeezing together, this cementing that's going on, and the full lithification process. This is stuff I talked about in the last lecture. As that's taking place, it's happening in this horizontal fashion because the whole idea of erosion and transportation and deposition, and this is stuff we'll get into when I start talking about geomorphology, it's working with gravity. Whether it's just falling from a hill and some kind of mass wasting, or if it's a fluvial process where you have flowing water that's picking stuff up, carrying it away. Water's only flowing if gravity is causing it to flow, right? Water doesn't move on its own, it's falling downhill, right? It's moving with gravity or under the influence of gravity. So, by the time this stuff, as it's getting carried away, by the time it stops getting carried away, it's when it flattens out, when gravity is no longer pulling on it. Same thing with lava flowing out of a volcano. That stuff's going to spill down the side of the volcano, but if it flattens out, it's not going to continue to flow. And so that stuff will cool horizontally, right? That's the idea behind it. So what we're saying is, when these rock layers here formed, they initially formed in this horizontal fashion. And you might be thinking like, wow, that really doesn't matter to my life. That's boring and kind of, frankly, seems kind of obvious. It's when, and we're not going to fully do it, so you're not going to really realize how useful these things are, but it is useful to state these, to have these laws in place so that we can then go from there, right? So even if these sound kind of obvious, just go with it for now. Okay, so there's this first one. The second one is the principle of superposition, just saying the layer below is older than the layer above. Which, if you think about it for 5 seconds, you're like, well, duh, again, but still, gotta go with it, right? So it's the idea that this one on the bottom, that had to form first, right? So it's the oldest, and then once this had formed, this second one could form on top of it, right? But this is why that whole principle of original horizontality also is helpful in some of this other stuff. Like, we know it's just a very simple, straightforward process. So this color material, this darker stuff, gets laid out initially. It lithifies, the rock forms, it's there first. Right? More time goes past, this stuff gets carried down, it gets squeezed together, lithifies, it's there. More time goes past, this stuff comes down. Same process, right? And again, we're dealing with relative dating. I don't know exactly when this rock here formed. I don't know exactly when this formed, but I know the order, right? I know that this layer formed first, and then this one was second. Or, another way to say the exact same thing is that this layer is older than this layer on top of it, right? Or, another way to think about it is that as we're digging into the earth, we're going back in time, right? That's why, archaeologists and paleontologists, when they're finding stuff, you're digging down, and that's because of the whole dynamic process of, lithification and how rocks work, as well as, soil development and geomorphology, all this different stuff. Some of it we've talked about, some we'll talk about in future lectures here. The whole idea is that as we dig down, we're digging back in time, meaning we're going back into older material, right? And it just makes me think of, I blew a guy's mind somewhere in outside of Sacramento, the Central Valley. I was back when I was an archaeologist working on a project, and he was, I don't even remember what they're doing. This is, again, can't remember a month. How can I remember what I was doing 20 years ago? But it's the idea that these guys were out working in the field. I was like monitoring what they were doing to make sure they didn't dig up, important artifacts, human remains, whatever it might be. And I don't think we found anything on this particular project, but when I kind of explained this concept to one of the guys out there working in the field, it blew his mind. And just how, like, to go back 10,000 years, how little you actually had to dig into the Central Valley, that he was so excited. He wanted to go find, like, woolly mammoths and stuff like that. But and it was great. Like, it was adorable and how excited he was to find treasure. But it is pretty cool to think about how, as you're digging down, you're going back in time. Like, that's just cool. And if you don't think it's cool, well, may God have mercy on your soul. I mean, come on, that is awesome. That is fantastic stuff. All right, let's move on. So that's okay. Original horizontality, superposition. Now, here's how this is also useful. If we find stuff that's tilted, well, we know something else. Like, we can start to say some things about this particular rock unit. And you hopefully, my Antelope Valley College students, you recognize this formation. If you don't, well, don't go there now, because it's probably closed. Hopefully it's closed. I don't know. But this is, what is this? It's Vasquez Rocks, right? As you head down the 14, we see this fantastic shape. You see it in all sorts of science fiction movies and stuff, just because it's super cool. And it's fantastic to look at. But what it is too is that this is just indicative of California geology that we have. Like, to go back to this, I had to steal this picture off of Google. I've never seen anything like this around California, simply because we don't have stuff this flat. We're very tectonically active. I'll get into exactly what that means with the next lecture when we really get into the theory of plate tectonics. But what we see out here instead is these tilted things, right? We call it uplift, which is where the Earth itself actually gets pushed up from tectonic activity. Again, I'll get into how that works in a bit. But that uplift, and therefore the tilting that often occurs as well, like we see right here, that happened after the rocks formed. So Vasquez rocks, it's all sandstone out there. And so this formed horizontally to start with, so we can envision flattening this out, right? Leveling it out. And it's always a rule with this stuff. And we'll get into exactly the philosophy behind this, but you want to keep this simple. We've never seen tectonic activity where the Earth's crust actually flips onto its back, right? Like a turtle getting knocked over or whatever. So we know that this right here wasn't the bottom and this here wasn't the top, right? It wasn't a case that it was so massive that this was on the bottom and then it just flipped all the way onto its back. No, what happened? There was some compression taking place, this uplift occurring, and so this was on the bottom, and so it was down here and then got pushed up this way. So it tilted in this direction as opposed to, so there we go, this direction, right? So keep it simple. Again, we'll get into a little more on that in a bit, but we know this layer down here, this stuff was forming first before this stuff up here, right? And we'll continue to look at this whole tilting thing in a bit, but that's the general idea. So we can start to tell a story of Vasquez rocks or anything else like this. So we can find that, thing that was on the bottom. We know it was horizontal, so we could say the lowest layer of sedimentary rock, distinct sedimentary strata, that formed first, and the one on top of it came next, and so on. And then once all of those rock layers formed, then we had some kind of tectonic activity. The stuff got pushed up. And of course, as it got pushed up, it didn't just stay exactly as it was, we had erosion taking place. And that leads to the jagged nature of this. This is actually what the erosion and weathering and deposition and some of this geomorphology stuff we'll talk about. That's what makes this stuff sexy, right? Nobody would care if we just had rectangular blocks of sandstone or granite or whatever it might be. These really breathtaking, beautiful places are the ones in which erosion has occurred, but not completely. Didn't wipe everything out. It left these cool, jagged shapes and all that. Right? That's the good looking stuff. And that came after the uplift. All right. And so we're telling this story. We've got, 3 or 4 different events, and we can say first this happened, then this, then that, then this. And that's how we start to figure out how a place came to be. We still don't have absolute dates, but we're getting that sense of the order of events, and we're able to tell that story in the rocks. What happened to these rocks? Here's another example. I'm not going to waste my time talking about this stuff because you would see something. I drew my own version of this, but you'd see something kind of like this on your test, and you'd have to piece it together, figure this stuff out. And so what we're looking at, this would be today, right here, and then this is going back in the order of events. Right? So this would be initially, you can see everything's horizontal, stuff is getting laid out. We can just envision these as just kind of generic sedimentary units, each different pattern that we have. So these form, we have the uplift, we have the erosion occurring, and that's similar to Vasquez rocks, but then this one has this extra step of a new sedimentary layer being set on top of it because of whatever it might be, changing sea levels. It could be changing just weather and stuff like that, leading to more water coming in. This stuff getting covered up in this way. But this angular unconformity, that's a clue in the rocks. So we see that this was exposed, that there was some kind of erosion occurring or taking place in an area. So that's how we apply it. This is another one. I'm not gonna, whatever. Stuff cuts through other stuff. The stuff it's cutting through has to be older than the thing that's doing the cutting, right? I don't think I put any test questions on it. You're not gonna use it because we're not doing the picture. Let's move on. Here we go. This is what we want. Enough actual rock pictures. Let's get into some philosophy, some logic, some ways in which we think about the world around us. So one of the greatest concepts, I think, in just, how we solve any problem, whether it's some, very complex scientific thing or just how we live our lives or whatever. I think Occam's razor is this brilliant thing to keep in mind. Okay? And so a definition, I got this from Merriam-Webster online. I searched it out, wrote this down. So Occam's razor is a scientific and philosophical rule that entities should not be multiplied unnecessarily, which is interpreted as requiring that the simplest of competing theories be preferred to the more complex, or that explanations of unknown phenomena be sought first in terms of known quantities. I think they're messing with us. I think the Merriam-Webster people are totally messing with us here because the definition they gave of Occam's razor totally goes against Occam's razor because it's so complex. Here's my own version. With Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is always the best explanation. Right? So what we're saying is, and this goes back to this whole simplest of competing theories, blah, 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 blah. If you've got a few different ways to explain how something came to be, it's going to be that simpler one. Right? It's going to be that simplest explanation. Now, it doesn't mean, and we'll see this, I'll talk about this and apply it to the theory of plate tectonics and how we know that plate tectonics exist, and we'll talk about how this whole theory came to be and the processes through how different people went through and figured stuff out and worked together and all of that. We'll see it applied. And a lot of this stuff, even if it's the simplest explanation, it's still not simple. I mean, it's a pretty amazing explanation, but it's a lot simpler than some of these other ones that were provided, right? And so it also means if you give And this term theory here, referring to not just the guess kind of hypothesis thing, but like if you have a theory, to remember it's to explain why something is the way it is. If you are developing one of these theories and you've got all these unsupported ideas behind it, it's gonna be wrong. You're overthinking it, or you're screwing it up in some way. I think one of the best examples or introductions to Occam's razor I had was as a little baby archaeology student many years ago. And I still remember it was my very first archaeology class. I was so excited. And it's at UCLA where they have this big, like, theater. Like, I remember the professor walking onto the stage. I'm expecting, he's going to be some kind of Indiana Jones, some kind of hardcore, man of adventure. Such a nerd, walking out, and wound up being a fantastic professor. I took a bunch of classes from because I thought he was a brilliant guy, but it's just not that kind of guy you expect to come waltzing out. No leather jacket or bullwhip or any of that stuff. But still, the guy was brilliant and fantastic, and I loved him. And so he comes out, and they're like, it's one of those things where it was like 200 or 300 students in this thing, and we're all ready to take notes and to learn how to be grown-up archaeologists. And so he comes out, and he's got, and I think it's actually at the time where we had slides, like actual slide projectors, not this PowerPoint stuff and computers and all that. So he comes out, puts up the first slide, and he said, aliens did all this stuff. Right? It was all aliens. When we're looking at ancient civilizations and pyramids and stuff like that, it's aliens. They did it. And so me and the other students in there were like, really? That, we already always told that was bullshit. But that, so that, okay, we're writing it. So, okay, it was aliens. And he shows this image, the slide that he shows to prove this. It's a sarcophagus lid. Okay, so it's rock of some kind, and it's got intricate carvings all over it. And it is, and so it's Mayan. Okay, you kind of can envision what this stuff looks like. If you can't, pause this, do some Google image searches of just Mayan glyphs and that kind of stuff. You'll see very beautiful imagery and very distinct human faces and all of that. But it's the carving of this Mayan guy riding a speeder bike from Return of the Jedi. The little space motorcycles they got in the third, like, original Star Wars movies. He's on one of them. Right now, it's not a picture. It's a carving, but it's so clearly, you have the Mayan guy on top of it, and he's like working the controls. His hands are doing this thing, and he's on the speeder bike. It's this very elaborate, clearly alien technology, and out of the back are like flames coming out from the rocket boosters that propel this Mayan king or whoever it was just around, the Guatemalan forest. Oh, it was just so cool. All right, oh my god, and the alien, not just aliens coming, but they had speeder bikes. That's great. We're writing, notes in our notebooks. That's what good students do. Something to think about. And so writing this down. Or the professor says, and he advances the next slide. So it's either speeder bikes and aliens and all that stuff, or corn. And the next slide, it's the same sarcophagus lid, but it's just turned 90 degrees. So instead of the Mayan guy like hunched over this speeder bike, it's now clearly this stalk of corn, and the Mayan guy's doing a little dance next to it. Right? He's not actually writing it and working the controls. He's doing a dance like corn is the best. That's what he's doing. And it's not flames coming out of the back of a space motorcycle. They're roots, because it's a plant, right? So it's either alien technology for the Mayans, corn. Now, clearly, corn is less sexy. That's not exciting. Nobody gets excited about that explanation. But when you think about it, nobody's actually found a speeder bike next to some, mummy in Belize or Guatemala or whatever. We don't find a big, chamber at the bottom of one of these temples or pyramids or sites around Central America, and it's like all sorts of alien, you know, bicycle parts or whatever. Well, we don't see it. So, like, the explanation is for this that, oh, yeah, so what happened was the aliens came down and gave them the space motorcycles and taught them, physics and how to build pyramids and all that stuff. And everything was going good until the aliens, like, got pissed off with the Maya. And then they took away all their space bikes and that kind of stuff. Took it away. That's why we've never found it, right? And they did something so made all the evidence go away, and then the Maya die out, and here we are today, right? Or corn. Clearly, the answer is that, yeah, it's a drawing of corn because corn was important because that helped this whole civilization exist, right? That's the simplest explanation. It's the right explanation. And sure, if someday I will apologize personally to each and every one of you if in the next few years we find a space bike somewhere in Guatemala. Yeah, clearly I was wrong. But I mean, this idea of the space motorcycles, this wasn't something he came up with. There are different authors who have proposed, it's the whole ancient aliens kind of thing. You guys have probably seen. I'll admit, I watch those things like crazy. I show them to my kids. We love that garbage, but it's also, we also say like, yeah, but it's garbage, and we talk about why, but it's still fun, right? But if we find that stuff, I'll apologize, but we haven't. People have been talking about this for decades, and it just doesn't happen. And really, the simplest explanation for the idea that aliens helped these people in the ancient world build incredible things, the simplest explanation is it's racism. Right? It's the idea, because it's always white guys, like me, sitting talking about like, yes, it's clearly the aliens, and it's all because you can't envision that brown people, that people who aren't Europeans, could actually come up with amazing architectural wonders and have this really cool technology and all of that stuff. It's always that assumption that, yeah, they had to have some kind of outside help. Europeans, that makes sense because superior culture and all that. But these simple brown people, no, it's got to be aliens. That's the simplest explanation. It's a racist thing. So that said, Occam's razor is when we're trying to explain what's happening out in nature and in the past, whatever it might be, go with that simplest explanation. All right, it's another thing I stole, but it's still, I think it's quite useful to envision it and put this, not talk about aliens and stuff, but just talk about it from a geologic perspective. This is how we can utilize Occam's razor. So what this is showing are these core samples. Okay? So each line here that we have going down with the different colors, that's a core sample that was taken where we drilled down with a hollow drill bit, and so that you can pull up the soil and the rock and all that from the earth, and we measure it out and we get a sense of, okay, you go down far, like glacial right here, sorry about glacial drift, it's soil and gravel and stuff like that. Then we have this layer of dolomite, shale, sandstone, granite, as you continue to work down here, so we're getting a picture of these different layers of rocks in the earth. And this is quite useful when you're dealing with an area where we don't have, in fact, if I go back here to like this stuff, if we can't see clearly these different layers because of like a road cut or whatever. In fact, if we go back here, this kind of stuff, the reason we can see this is because there's a road right here. And when we're building roads, what we do in this country is we blow up the mountain to put the road through it. Right? It's a great thing about, especially living out here in the Mojave Desert, Southern California in general. We've got a lot of these where you can drive by and you can see all of these different rock layers and you get a sense of what's going on because we blew up the mountain to put a road through there. But we also have areas like here where you can't do that. We're talking about a massive area where we can't possibly go in and just make some big canyon 50 miles long or something like that. We do the next best thing, which is we drill down, get a sense of what's there, and then it's the geologist's job or the geographer's job, as the case may be, to interpolate, the fun term of saying, fill in the white space here. Figure out, we know what's happening here, we know what's happening here. Well, what's the story here? Right? That's our job. We're sampling, we're getting data, and we're trying to fill in the gaps. And so, we could do this. Well, we have two options, right? We could simply connect the dots. We could see where this, sandstone layer is, that yellow right here. It's here. We see it here. We see it here, here, and so on. We could just draw that line. We could connect those things, right? And do the same thing with the dolomite and the granite and all of this stuff. And, it's a nice, simple picture. Or we could do this down here, where we don't necessarily know that it's the case, but maybe our gut just tells us that we have like these broken chunks of sandstone in here. And we have this weird pluton of granite coming in here that's just, it's irregular and jagged. We don't have any evidence to really show that, but it looks so cool, right? Or at this, you know what this is? It's a fault. So, and this, we're dealing with Wisconsin here. So, not the most tectonically active area, but maybe there's this massive fault that runs through here. There's, earthquakes have taken place before humans were here, or something like that. Yeah, that's another possibility. But if we're going with our Occam's razor, this one's right, this one's wrong. And if you really believe this too, a good way to, prove your idea that there's a fault here or we have weirdness going on and all that is to simply, what? Drill, right? Dig down, get another core sample or a few more core samples or whatever to look at this and get a sense of what's happening in these areas, right? But the other thing is that the burden of proof is on the person who's proposing what appears to be, the most complex, the craziest explanation. All right, so if I feel that it's not this simplest explanation, if I feel in my heart, in my gut, or whatever, that this is what's going on in this area, it's up to me to prove it, because the simplest explanation is that I'm actually wrong, right? That I'm just a whack job, or mean well, but I don't really know what I'm talking about, or whatever. It's up to me to demonstrate that no, this actually is what's going on, but I got to do the work to show it, right? That's the idea. So that's how we apply Occam's razor in this sense. And also, so we just talked about uniformitarianism. This is exactly how uniformitarianism works. The simplest explanation is that these different processes that are happening today, how material erodes, how rocks lithify, like all this geologic stuff we have covered, stuff we'll continue to talk about in the next few lectures. The simplest explanation is all this stuff, if it works like this today, and we don't have any evidence to suggest otherwise, then it's always worked like this since the Earth started, right? Since the Earth initially formed. Right? Because the other idea is that we've got stuff that can be explained with today's geological processes, but it actually wasn't that way. It was something totally different, going back to that whole catastrophism idea. That's not the simplest explanation, right? So therefore, this is why scientists use this whole principle of uniformitarianism. This is why scientists don't use this young Earth model, because the simplest explanation is that the Earth is incredibly old and it has these different things that are going on, these different systems and processes that are very slow, they're very tiny when we humans look at them, but over millions of years, the results are incredibly powerful, right? Like the Grand Canyon or the Himalaya or whatever it might be that we're talking about. Okay? So uniformitarianism, to go back to that, that's a perfect example of Occam's razor. All right, now let's finish up here with this idea of absolute dating. So we got into how we put things in order get a sense of what happened first, second, third. But what's really useful is when we can get an absolute date. When we can say this thing formed so many millions of years ago, right? And the only way we can do this successfully is through this process called radiometric dating. And there are another different ways in which people tried to absolutely date stuff. Nothing worked. Once we cracked this has been incredibly useful. And it wasn't perfect to start with. I mean, there's been a lot of work that's gone into radiometric dating, getting these numbers right, and all that. But now that we got it, it's phenomenal. So this is how we can absolutely date rocks. Okay? So radiometric dating is dealing with radioactive decay of these specific isotopes, these elements that exist in rocks. Okay? And radioactive decay simply referring to how the elements inside these rocks are actually physically breaking down. They're breaking apart, and they're actually what's happening. And I have more slides on this, I think. But what's happening is it starts as one element, but as it decays, it turns into a totally new element. Okay? And the time at which it takes half of that sample of that original element to decay into this new element, we refer to that as a half-life. Okay? I'm going to get into this. We'll go through it slowly because it is kind of conceptually, it's kind of wacky for students to get and to go with. So I've got some pictures. We'll try to go through this. And honestly, this isn't a physics class or something where we're trying to actually do this. I just want you to have the general understanding of what is taking place here, right? So you understand how I can say the Earth is 4.6 billion years old, or any of this other stuff. The Grand Canyon was formed, starting 5 million years ago, or whatever. And I just want you to get that general concept. Okay, so we have these specific elements that we're dealing with. I have the example here, potassium 40, okay, and then argon 40, we'll talk about. And the 40 there, it's just saying this is a radioactive version of potassium, okay? So as it's aging, as every day goes on, this potassium 40, it's decaying, it's getting old, right? Like us, you can kind of think of this as like humans or any other living being. Time is going on, it's aging, it's decaying. But as this thing is decaying, it's getting rid of subatomic particles. So think back to whatever science class you had, physics or physical science or whatever, back in high school. When you learn about this, all the protons and electrons and that stuff, that's what we're talking about. And so, as these things are released or leaving, think about it, it's losing these subatomic particles, it's releasing energy. And this is actually why the Earth is so hot inside the planet itself. Okay? The heat inside the Earth that leads to magma and therefore lava and all of that, that's because of this radioactive decay. So it's coming from these things falling apart inside the Earth. And so that's the energy. That's this heat that we'll be talking about later when we get into plate tectonics. But it's also, as it's releasing these subatomic particles, that by definition makes this atom of potassium 40 into something new. Okay? And in this case, it's going to change into argon 40. I'm really not interested in you guys knowing the exact pairs, but the generic idea is that we start out with this initial element, and we call that the parent element. Okay? So it starts out as the parent. In this example, the parent is potassium 40. Then as time goes on, as this decay takes place, an atom of the parent element, as it loses those subatomic particles, it's going to turn into the daughter element, okay, which in this case is argon 40. So starts out as parent, decays, turns into the daughter. All right, hopefully that makes sense. And again, as I said, we have this concept of half-lives, right, which is the amount of time it takes for half of the parent atoms to decay and turn into the daughter. So to make this hopefully make some sense, I have this graphic I put together where we've got, okay, potassium 40, 100 atoms. So I've got 100 squares in here, okay, each square representing one atom of potassium 40. And so this means because we have, it's all potassium 40, there's no argon 40, so it's all parent, no daughter, no time has passed. Okay, this rock just formed. The lava just cooled, or whatever it is, whatever kind of rock we're dealing with here. So it just forms, okay, lithifies right here. So it's zero, it's brand new, it's a baby rock when we look at this, okay? All parent, no daughter. But as time goes on, we're eventually going to get to the point where we have half, okay, so 50 atoms are the parent, potassium 40, and then 50 other atoms have turned into the daughter, argon 40. Okay? So it's this 50-50 ratio, half parent, half argon. And so we describe this as one half-life having passed. And don't get too hung up on this whole why we do the half-life thing and all of that, but we're just looking at the amount of time it takes for half of that original parent sample to turn into the daughter. All right, so in this case, the yellow now is that daughter. So one half-life has passed, and we know, based on math and testing and all sorts of stuff that brilliant people have done, is that one half-life for potassium 40 to turn into argon 40, it's 1.3 billion years. So it takes 1.3 billion years for half those potassium 40 atoms to decay and turn into argon 40, which means if I get a rock sample and I'm going through a, put it through a mass spectrometer to get a sense of all the different elements and stuff that are in there, if I see this 50-50 ratio, half parent, half daughter, I know that rock has to be 1.3 billion years old, right? Because initially we have 100 atoms, 0 atoms. The thing is brand new, 0 years have passed. That's what it would look like. Okay? After 1.3 billion years, this is what the chemical makeup is going to be. Right? These are the elements we're going to see, in addition to some other stuff we'll see. Okay? So that's the idea. We know that one half-life has passed. And maybe we don't, we say you dig up a rock and you're testing it, and it's, 700 million years old or something like that. It's not going to be this perfect 50-50. There's going to be a little more potassium than there is argon. We do the math, and we can figure that out. So we don't have to, hope we find something with one perfect half-life, but we know that's this 50-50 ratio, that's what it's going to look like. And then here's the crazy thing, and this is fun with math and all that, but then for another half-life to pass, okay, it's where half of the 50 now decay and turn into daughters. So now we have this relationship of 25 atoms of the parent, 75 of the daughter. 2 half-lives have passed because we went from here to then half of this blue over here decaying. That's another 1.3 billion years. So we know 2 half-lives have passed, which is 1.3 plus 1.3, which is 2.6 billion years. That's how old this rock is. And so on. It would just keep, a half of a half of a half. That's how we can figure out just how old a rock is, okay, with actual certainty, right? To have that absolute date. Here's another one. Stole this from another textbook. Same kind of idea, but showing it in a slightly different way. But in this case, okay, we have over here the number of atoms, and it's referring to really, how many parent atoms and how many daughter atoms we have. Down here are the half-lives that have gone past, right? So the green would be daughter, orange would be parent. So again, baby rock, brand new, just formed. it would have 100%, and again, we just use 100 to keep it simple to make it easier to grasp. But we have all of it. 100% of the stuff is parent, 0, therefore, daughter. Right? But by the time, as that rock ages, as these elements are decaying, once we get to this 50-50 thing, half parent, half daughter, one half-life has passed. In this case, we're doing uranium-238, lead-206. It's got a half-life of 4.5 billion years, which is pretty massive, right? So if we were to find a rock with a perfect one half-life has passed of the stuff, it would be this original rock on the planet, right? And we won't find anything with two half-lives having passed here on the planet unless it was, imported, because we're just not this old. But it's still the idea. As time goes on, fewer and fewer parent atoms, more and more daughter atoms, and we just keep looking at that ratio to figure out how many half-lives have passed. Once we figure that out, we can say absolutely how old this rock is. When did it initially lithify and form, right? And we have a bunch of different elements, the parents and daughter relationships that exist. I'm not going to make you memorize these, or I don't care if you know these numbers or whatever, but we have a lot of options here. And again, this has been stuff that has been tested, and nobody was starting to clock this stuff like 4 billion years ago and kind of watch it going. And like I said, we've refined a lot of this stuff. A lot of work has gone into it, and this is how we can definitively say how old specific rocks are, assuming they have this stuff in them, right? Hopefully that makes sense. If you're stuck on it, shoot me a line. We can go through it. I'm sure YouTube has great stuff as well. I probably should have watched that myself, seeing if there's a good example. Hey, maybe I'll do that. I don't know. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I just want you to grasp the idea, the general idea of parent, daughter, half-lives. Okay, and that's how we do this absolute dating. Another thing with this is you might be thinking, this sounds a lot like carbon dating. Carbon dating is simply one type of radiometric dating. Now, we're not going to use it for rocks or fossils because carbon dating only works for organic remains, things that were living. Okay? And it's the idea that we have carbon-14, which we're bringing into our bodies, and we're flushing out any waste, which it's the parent is carbon-14, the daughter is nitrogen-14. So as we're walking around and we're alive, everything's cool. We have this healthy amount of carbon-14 in us, and we're getting rid of any bad stuff, decaying stuff, or whatever. But as soon as we die, we stop flushing the bad stuff out, and so it's kind of the same idea as a rock forming. Carbon dating tells us exactly when something died. Right? And again, with both of these, you can think of it as like a stopwatch, right? It's like or a counter, some kind of timer or whatever that we've learned how to read. But as once that rock forms, something like potassium or any of these other ones that we saw, once that starts decaying, that's like the clock starting to just tick along. Same thing with organic things, like when we die, we stop bringing new carbon-14 in. So that's the stopwatch idea, that it slowly decays and turns into nitrogen-14. It's got roughly almost a 6,000 year half-life. So when archaeologists are going out and finding organic remains, burial sites and stuff like that, and they do this carbon dating, it works as long as the stuff hasn't fossilized, right? As long as we're dealing with organic remains. And we can look at the half-lives, that ratio between the carbon and the nitrogen, get a sense of how old this thing was, again, when it died. All right, so hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully this stuff is clear. But that's how we know exactly how old this stuff is that I keep mentioning. That's how we figured it out. All right, folks, next time, the next lecture, we're going to get into the theory of plate tectonics. And this is good stuff. Don't miss it. Like you could miss it, right? What else are you going to do? Right? You're not going anywhere. You're stuck at home. So hopefully this will be up soon. All right. Have a lovely lovely rest of your day.